The story of Japanese Americans proves otherwise. For decades, after their incarceration in the Second World War, survivors received redress. Now, veterans of the movement are fighting for reparations for black Americans. I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. Here's a story I found in The Guardian that you might find very interesting. Kochi still remembers the small brown envelope her family received from the U.S. Department of Justice more than 30 years ago. It looked like any other piece of official government mail with a Washington, D.C. postmark, but inside was a printed letter signed by President George H.W. Bush, and two checks for $20,000, one for each of her parents. Her parents were among the 82,000 Japanese Americans who received redress after being forced into concentration camps during the Second World War under the guise of national security. In one of the darkest chapters in modern U.S. history, the payments were the culmination of a hard-fought 20-year movement driven by Sansei or Sanwi, or third-generation Japanese Americans like Ochi seeking justice for their elders. Ochi's parents needed the money. Incarceration had stalled their careers, and they used it for a new roof to update their kitchen, then shared some with their four daughters. But it was about more than money. We were vindicated, said Ochi, now 76. It began to lift the weight most of us have carried around. The checks made Japanese Americans one of the only ethnic groups ever to win reparations from the U.S. government. Now, decades later, their victory is taking on new weight as black Americans fight for reparations of their own. Proposals to compensate descendants for the lasting harms of slavery and discrimination are underway across the U.S., most notably in California, where a first-in-the-nation's task force recently recommended a formal apology, cash payments to the descendants of enslaved people, and other policies to address enduring discrimination. But those efforts have also invited a vocal backlash and will face a prolonged battle to win over public political support. Many veterans of the Japanese American movement for redress are getting back into the fight for reparations. Once again, they say, it's the right thing to do, and it's a matter of reciprocity. The Japanese American movement has heavily inspired, or was heavily inspired, by the Civil Rights Movement, and black members of Congress were key allies in persuading the government to back it. These activists are bringing a rare message to the movement, one of hope. The Japanese American experience can be pointed to and used to show that reparations are possible, Ochi said. It's happened here, it's possible, and it's necessary. Now, right now, I'm going to show you the letter her family received from the U.S. Department of Justice 30 years ago. I'm going to try to enlarge it here. See if I can do it well. I'll do my best to get it in front of the camera. That's the mother, and that's the letter by. It's an official presidential apology from the U.S. government for the internment of putting Japanese people in concentration camps. They got a letter, an apology, and each person was given $20,000 each. Think about that for a moment. While the story of what has happened to Japanese Americans during the Second World War is now well known for decades, it was barely discussed. Like many in her generation, June Habino grew up only hearing her parents briefly reference the concentration camps. They were among the 120,000 people of Japanese descent on the West Coast, rounded up and put into concentration camps that spanned from California to Arkansas, over claims of espionage and disloyalty to the U.S. Many survivors didn't want to talk about their trauma, and parents often wanted to shield their kids from the racism they experienced. It was the redress movement that shone a light on the atrocity for the community and the nation. The push for reparations began as early as 1970 when the Japanese American Citizens League called for legislation that would make amends to those incarcerated during the war. But it wasn't until the early 1980s when hundreds of survivors and their families testified at federal commission hearings across the country that the movement gathered momentum. So here's an actual photograph of them coming before the commission. Getting involved with the redress movement years after college prompted Habino to finally talk to her parents about what happened to them. She then testified on their behalf at an August 1981 commission hearing at Golden Gate College in San Francisco. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I lost the feed. She spoke of the harvest her family lost on their farm, of her father who studies at the University of California, Berkeley, were cut short and never resumed, and of her grandmother who got sick with an infection a few months into incarceration and died alone in the hospital. The government not allowing her family to visit her on her deathbed, and she spoke of the continuing racism she faced as a third-generation Japanese American. For my parents, for my people, I demand monetary compensation, she said then. And as a Sansi, I demand the truth be brought out for all to know. Reparations is our right, and it's been 40 years late in coming, and anything less would be nothing but a token and a whitewash. She described how listeners were on the edge of their seats as survivors spoke of things they hadn't even shared with their own families. People broke down in tears. Habino, now 70, told The Guardian. Others were so angry they pounded the table because they were finally being allowed to say what happened to them. So this is June Habino. With a portrait of someone in her family in the background. Ochi, a member of the National Coalition for Redress / Reparations, or NCRR, one of the major Japanese American groups pushing for reparations, remembers feeling stunned. How could all of this have been kept so quiet, untold for 4 decades? She said. It wasn't until then that she realized the extent of the community's suffering, as well as their losses of businesses, homes, and land of freedom and dignity. They were all stories that hadn't been documented. We as a community had to write our own history, Ochi said. Now the truth was finally out in the open, but winning reparations also meant fighting in the courts and in Congress. To be continued. I'm Tyrone Bowman. Never surrender. Never quit.